You're listening to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast, episode 34, hosted by me, Robert Plotkin. Today I'm going to be speaking with Rohan Gunatilake, an innovator in the design of technology that promotes mindfulness. Rohan is probably best known for Buddhify, one of the oldest and most well-known guided meditation apps available. He's also the founder of Mindfulness Everywhere, a creative studio that combines meditation, technology, and design, and which is responsible not only for Buddhify, but also for the mindfulness apps Sleepfulness and Kara, and the book Modern Mindfulness, How to Be More Relaxed, Focused, and Kind While Living in a Fast, Digital, Always-On World. We're extremely pleased to welcome Rohan Gunatilake to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast. In the upcoming interview with Rohan Gunatilake, you'll hear him talk about all of the ways in which he and his team at Mindfulness Everywhere design new products in ways to help us have a better experience as users and to be more mindful. And for today's tip, I'm going to give you some suggestions for how to stay more focused by choosing which products you already have to use. In particular, my suggestion is to use a single purpose device for whatever task you're about to perform. What do I mean by that? That could be as simple as using an old-fashioned pen and paper to write, or for reading, to take out one of your Kindles if you have one. I've got an old black and white Kindle. All I can do with it is read books. And the reason I say this is it's so easy for us to pull out our smartphone reflexively to do whatever it is we want to do next, because they're so great at being able to do everything. And that can be really super convenient and allow us to do things everywhere. But the downside of it is that when we have a device that's capable of doing everything simultaneously, anywhere, really quickly, it can be hard to stay focused on doing just one thing. So my tip is that if you are having a hard time staying focused, doing one thing at a time with your smartphone, try using a single purpose device. Another great example is to use an old-fashioned alarm clock to wake yourself up. Helps you keep your smartphone out of your bed, and you'll know that when you reach for that alarm to turn it off in the morning, you won't be tempted to then use it to check your email, because it's not possible, because the only thing that alarm clock can do for you is wake you up. So try it out. Try using single purpose devices, and I hope you enjoy the upcoming interview with Rohan Gunatilake. Hi, Rohan, and welcome to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast.
Hey, Robert, great to be here.
It's really great to have you on. There's a million things we could talk about. Many people may know about you through your very popular and long-standing meditation app, Buddhify, which I would like to talk about. But the first thing I'd like to start with is something I heard you say in one of your talks, which I find really fascinating. If I understood you correctly, you said one of the things you like to do or have as a focus in Buddhify and all of your other products is to make sure that the product is imbued with the kinds of qualities you're trying to promote in the product itself.
Sure.
I mean, I guess that would mean a meditation app that bombards people with ads is probably, not the kind of thing you would want to do. But could you talk about that as a design philosophy, and particularly how it relates to products that promote mindfulness?
Sure, absolutely. So I think as an app maker or app designer, I think the question is like, what are the boundaries of your product? So because the main way in which meditation apps works is that they work through guided meditations in some way, some kind of audio. One way of viewing a meditation app is that it's only about the audio content, and everything else is not really part of the mindfulness experience. It's just purely the the guided practices. But for me, that feels a very limited understanding of sort of holistic. I much prefer a sort of holistic sense of a product. And so I guess the principle or the idea behind Buddhify and the other stuff that we make is what would it be like if every interaction or every aspect of using one of our products supported the intention of the user, supported their ability to be calm, kind, aware, and what would that look like? So that's if you think of that as the overall aspiration, then that influences everything. So that influence on the sort of the literal product design side, it impacts what it feels like to press a button, what color palette you use, what visual aesthetic you use. Within Buddhify itself, those people listening who know the product will know that there's this wheel interface that we have used for a number of years. Yeah, and I think that we spent a lot of time working on the way that the wheel animates, and so that it's just pleasurable to press a button. There's a sort of little joy. There's a little bit of pleasure that that happens in the mind of the user, that comes with delight. That when you're tapping a button, and what that means is that, when people, from a designer perspective, when people are using meditation apps, often it's because they're feeling a little bit stressed or unsettled in that moment, and so if you can bring a bit of delight through the interaction, it takes the edge off that difficulty that they're experiencing. And then importantly, as they then go into a guided practice, their mind state is a little bit softer, and so they're more likely to get benefit from the practice that they do, because there'll be a little bit less resistance, a little bit more openness. So that's within the sort of the boundaries of a sort of literally opening the app and going to your guided practice. And then and so that's like a simple example of how we think about a product sort of expressing all the values, or product trying to generate or encourage the overall objective of a product. And then if you think of it from that's the story, the example I gave there is maybe more of a positive one, but think of a negative one. So one of the most common feature requests within Buddhify is notification. So, hey, I really want to do more meditation, so can you put in some reminders within the app so that it tells me to meditate 2 times a day or whatever. The problem with the reason, but we never really integrated anything like that for a number of reasons. Firstly, that I hate notifications. I find them deeply annoying personally, which is as a maker, I hold as my right to bring a bit of authorial decision making to a product, but also for people, certain people and certain personalities react really well and respond really well to things like reminders and notifications. But there's also many people who don't. And we did some trials of a notifications feature. And what we found was that your meditation app telling you to meditate resulted in self-judgment, or you're feeling bad about yourself. And given that a lot of people use a meditation app to get rid of that, or to soften their inner criticism, or to work with that kind of self-judgment, if you instigate a feature such as notifications, then you're creating anxiety or self-judgment, and then the meditation that they listen to as a result softens it, and by the end of it you've got to net zero result. So as a maker in this, or anyone working in the context of mindfulness and meditation, I think it's really important to think about all aspects of how people engage with your product. That includes things like marketing and email marketing. It can fit the positive side of this is that it can really encourage, you can really make some lovely experiences for people. But the downside is that as a maker, you can feel paralyzed by it as well. I know people struggle with the people who work in mindfulness struggle with the idea of marketing and what's appropriate and so on. And it's up to individual people and companies to work out what's right for them. But the thing that's directed me is what's most in service of the individual who's using the product. So we don't send out a million emails a week, sort of encouraging people to use the app. And I think that sort of classic there's a suite of techniques within startup world or app world, sort of loosely called sort of growth hacking, which is a euphemistic way of sort of describing some fairly nefarious marketing practices.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, what those Robert, like the way that so many products work is that if you're able to bring people back again and again into your product, then you're able to then either upsell them into a subscription, or if they've already bought a subscription, can you continue to keep them within your system so that they don't cancel their subscription. And the sort of subscription model, which is in itself an aspect of design, right? Like the way that a product is sold and monetized is as much a part of the design as the logo or the content. And if you have a product which is dependent on subscription revenue, then by definition, that product is incentivized to keep you within their product, because otherwise they lose their revenue. And so, that makes complete business sense, and I completely understand why so many people use it. But in the context of meditation and mindfulness, my opinion is that the purpose of a good meditation app is to help you get to the point where you no longer need a meditation app. And that is orthogonal. That point of view is orthogonal with the idea of weekly or monthly subscriptions. And so, all these kinds of ideas and thinking have gone into inform our work. And I think the reason maybe that we're a little bit different in the way we approach things is that we're a much smaller company and a self-funded company, so we can afford to be slightly different. But also, as the person leading the company and the products that we make, I look after the content bit, and I also look after the product bit. So I have experience both in I write a majority of the meditations at the same time as design screens and think about how the business works. Whereas within bigger companies, the mindfulness experts are separate from the business experts, and that's a necessity of being a larger company. There will be more specialist roles, but the downside of that is that often commercial drivers or commercial objectives might not line up with user objectives or what's necessarily considered best in line from a mindfulness perspective. And so those different points of view then have to have a conversation. And if you work within a heavily invested environment, then that tends to be won by the money guys.
Right. I mean, I can really respect what you're doing in the sense that just as you started saying that often people are focused on the content, and certainly it would be enough for you to be focused on providing great guided meditation content. That's an amazing service to provide to people. But what I hear you saying is that your values and what you're trying to promote through the guided meditations also influences how you design the rest of the product, the user interface or the user experience from the time that people first launch the app and their entire experience through it, and the business model. as well. All of those things are integrated and driven by the same set of values. And I can respect it and also appreciate that that's a challenging thing to do, to have a holistic approach where the content, the design, and the business model are all aligned with each other.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not possible to do that. And whilst the intention is always to try and have that line up, sometimes it's not always possible. And also, when it is possible, the downside is often that we're limited. It limits us in certain ways. So, for example, Buddhify is it's most limited in its ability to scale or reach a large number of people due to the way that it prices itself, or the fact that we don't have access to large amounts of marketing budget. And so that's sort of our scale and our commercial success has been limited by our approach. But that was a decision we actively took. And there's and that, but there are times, to be completely honest, there are times where I wonder whether I made the right decision. But then there are times when I'm very, very happy and comfortable and confident in what we've done. And so we've been very fortunate. What started as a side project has been able to grow into a profitable business and support people and develop them, and also, like you say, it'll help a lot of people out there. And it's an interesting question that anyone working in technology has to ask, which is, how big is enough?
Yeah.
And what does scale really mean? And I think because I'm not based in the States, and my background is in, whilst I have worked in large companies, my background is also in having worked in the arts and worked in smaller sort of organizations and social value led organizations, and that has definitely informed my way of working. And I'm not. It's again like anything I say is not a criticism of other models. It's just where we've come from, and every model has their pros and cons. And I think the growth of mindfulness as a category and as a phenomenon through the last 5 to 10 years has been fundamentally a really wonderful thing. And we've definitely ridden on the coattails of some of the the Headspaces and Calms of this world, who've done an amazing job to make the market essentially and move mindfulness meditation into a whole new conversation. It's a very exciting space to be. And I still think there's a lot of growth and development. It feels, whilst it might feel like in certain parts of the world, and depending on what kind of bubble you're in, it can feel like we've reached peak mindfulness and everyone's doing it. But I think in the real world, to use a terrible phrase, if you think of like technology adoption cycles and think of mindfulness as a technology, which ultimately it is, I think we're only really moving out of early adopter into sort of early majority. If you think of that model, that particular model.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, many people think that once it hit the cover of Time magazine, that's a sign that it's past its peak. But
sure, and I think that there are some very clear signs that it's still an immature space. The fact that in the last couple of years, any technology that goes through its hype cycle at some point gets some kind of backlash, and we've seen, whether it's in the Guardian or in the New York Times, these sort of influential publications for the likes of the mindfulness community, when we've seen so-called negative narratives around mindfulness, the fact that the mindfulness community throws its arms up in the air and gets really worried about it and has to write screeds and screeds of defenses, for me is a sign of immaturity, because I think a mature marketplace can take criticism and get better and be able to criticize itself actually. I think for me that it will be the success, will be the sign of the mindfulness world growing up, is that it's able to see its shortfalls, talk publicly about it, and start to design them out. And that's what I try to do through my writing and thinking, to nudge in the little way that we can, sort of nudge the conversation into something more constructive, because I think we're in a bit of an evangelical moment, which is, it's always, when an individual, it's certainly true for me, when any person gets into mindfulness, you become very evangelical and you suddenly want all your friends to do it.
Right.
And you tell them all, and then, but not everyone wants to do it, and then you sort of get annoyed with them. But can't you see that it's the best thing ever? And then, sort of, we as a sort of the globe, the wider mindfulness community or industry is doing that. Is in the middle of that evangelical moment right now, and so it needs to settle down. And at the same time, and the fact that there's actually been less stuff in the press recently around mindfulness is a positive, I think, because it means it's becoming a bit more normalized, because ultimately that's success. Success is normalization, not making it a story each time.
Yeah, there was a while when it seemed like everyone was catching on to it as the greatest fad and cure-all for every ill of humanity. And clearly that got a lot of attention, which in some way is positive, but probably not healthy in the long term in the way that you're talking about. And you look back at yoga, gone through, probably more mature in terms of an industry, or been around longer, and that has gone through its own cycles. I've been more involved in the martial arts world, and there were certainly cycles, and still now, where there's been pushback from within the martial arts world, newer innovators criticizing traditional forms, and as you said, lots of traditional martial artists and teachers pushed back really hard against that in a way that, in some ways, wasn't healthy. This critique and attempts to innovate and test things against reality have turned out in the martial arts world, I think, to be really healthy, have caused everyone to really examine themselves and to improve. But it's been painful. It's definitely caused a lot of disruption along the way, but I think in the end, been healthy. But even there's an analogy where, there's a lot of martial arts that's popular as a sport only. It's somewhat lost the spiritual aspect. It's lost some of the holistic way of approaching it and practicing it and studying it. That's not something I think is particularly healthy. But these are all things which we've only just begun to see the tip of the iceberg with, in bringing mindfulness to a larger number of people.
Yeah, and it's still, for those within the context of martial arts and in mindfulness, those aspects, the more holistic aspects, are still available. They've not gone away. They just they're still part of the system. They're just not necessarily in the scalable part of the system. And I think the good news is that people who get into martial arts from a sport perspective, there will I'm assuming, but there will be a percentage of those who go, I want to get into the history of this and get into the holistic side. In the same way, people who get into mindfulness just to sleep better or to improve their putting game there'll be some people who go, they start pulling the string of how does this stuff actually work, and get really interested and end up going deeper. And anecdotally, I see that all the time. And we actually did a research project in the last year where we sort of mapped different people's pathways through different kinds of mindfulness and saw how people tried different interventions and starting through an app and then going further or adjacent into different things. And friends of mine who teach meditation retreats in San Francisco and elsewhere have had people turn up purely because who came through the app route, and they ended up all the way in the sort of much more intense and complicated area of sort of face-to-face residential retreats. So that sort of funnel, to use a marketing term, does work. But the danger is, I think, for people who have vested interest in the more traditional aspects of that funnel. So if you work in traditional martial arts or traditional meditation communities, the danger is that we put a value judgment on people who practice in different ways.
Right.
And say, well, that's not the real martial, that's not the real jujitsu, that's not the real meditation. Because, like what I've learned is that, like if someone wants to use mindfulness to sleep just a little bit better, and that's all they do, that's great. Like who am I to then go, oh, actually, you should be studying the Satipatthana Sutta and learning about original Buddhist training and do this and do that. And success is like, just because I grew up doing all sorts of hardcore meditation retreats, but I don't think the success, like I didn't make an app to turn people into meditators. I think the meditation world seems to be fixated on what I think we've fetishized the process rather than the outcome. So we fetishize the practice and certain types of the practice rather than the outcome, which is improving the mental well-being and thriving of people. But along the way, we've changed the objective to be everyone must become a meditator, which I think is the and yeah, like people will use meditation, in particular formal meditation, to achieve some of those outcomes, but that's not the point. The point isn't to take on the identity of the meditator. The point is to be kinder, or to see your difficult emotions and become better at dealing with them. And that is success, not whether you can, not how many retreats you've done or all these other sort of vanity metrics that tend to get chucked in there.
Oh, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And it's actually a good way of talking about the other work that you do. You don't just develop Buddhify, although no one would fault you if that's all that you did. But you lead Mindfulness Everywhere, which is a creative studio that makes products. I know you just mentioned doing some research studies into the effects of meditation or apps on people. Can you talk a little bit more about the broader work that you do, particularly as it relates to technology?
Yeah, I would describe ourselves as foolishly prolific in the sense that, it's a small team and it's sort of led by me, and I've always been sort of interested in having all sorts of different things. And whilst there's more than enough work in Buddhify itself, I've always been interested in sort of adjacent areas and bigger frames and smaller frames sometimes. So we've made other apps. We've made sort of custom products. So we made a project with a cancer hospital in Pittsburgh a couple of years ago, which was really lovely, called Kara, they approached us and said, what would a Buddhify look like for people who are affected by cancer? And we sort of made a small project for that, for them, which they refer their patients to, which is great. Like I said, we do research. And I think one of the pieces which has been most interesting in the last few years was what we call designing mindfulness. So this was the project where it was based on a very simple insight, which was the biggest meditation app in the world will only ever be a relatively small app in the context of technology as a whole. Because when you badge something as being to do with well-being or mindfulness or meditation or mental health, like you instantly limit the number of people who will be actively interested. So one way to scale, this is all come back to this question of what is scale and how big is big. And whilst I was reflecting on that, I was sort of thinking about how one way of scaling mindfulness is to do what Headspace and Calm are doing, or what they're doing really well, which is to sort of scale vertically. But another way to scale is to scale horizontally. And what that means is stitching what we know about mindfulness and well-being into everything. Because given that if mindfulness teaches us anything, it's that the quality and nature of your attention has a direct impact on your well-being. And so given that most of our popular technologies, especially from like messaging and social media and screen-based technologies, let's limit ourselves to that. Screen-based technologies are by definition attentional technologies. They are therefore by definition well-being technologies. And so how can any attentional technology start to think about how to be in support of positive well-being as opposed to negative well-being? Because the global conversation around the impact of particularly social media and content on our mental health is a live thing and complicated but important conversation. And part of the solution will be the makers of those technologies seeing what they can do to not necessarily make all of their products what I call mind positive, but at least to make them less mind negative. And because if products of the scale of Instagram or Snapchat or WeChat or all of these things, a small change in there towards supporting the attentional well-being of their users is socially important. It's material, and so all these companies have banks of people who are behavioral scientists or neuroscientists or psychologists, and their job at the moment is to trap you in their system and trap your attention long enough so they can sell it to a third party or sell you an in-app purchase or sell you a subscription. So all we need to do is make part of their job supportive of positive attentional behaviors. And for that to happen, companies just need to give a damn. And this is happening through the work of the likes of Tristan Harris and his colleagues are sort of the poster children for this conversation. It is happening, but I think we as users of technology have to become more literate and more aware in that actually the manipulation of our attention comes at a cost, and how much are we willing to put up with it.
I wonder if you could give people any examples either of changes that the kinds of companies you mentioned have already made, or some kind of simple change they could make to move their products more in the direction of what you called mind positive, just to make it concrete for people what you're talking about.
Sure, absolutely. I think that's actually why we did the Designing Mindfulness project, which was that because this conversation can tend to be very vague. And so we want to do some real life concept designs of what this might look like. So if you go to designingmindfulness.com, you'll see some concept designs that we did. And I think I'll give an example, but just before, in recent months, we've seen the likes of Apple and Facebook start to integrate some simple features like, whether it's like night mode or turning on, changing what apps are available at certain times of the day and measuring, showing you your data. So that's, incredibly simple things, which is the start. Some people might consider that a token effort, but at least it's a start. I'll give a particular example. So if you go to Designing Mindfulness, it's a bit of a technical, geeky website, and that sort of design. It's for designers and software makers. And so we come up with different principles, software principles or design principles, and one of them is called respect information zones. So what this means is get out of the way effectively, and avoid putting too much information into the user's view, which is redundant or unnecessarily, and at worst creates anxiety. And so the example we give is actually within iOS, where those of you who have iPhones know that if you have a notification or notifications in your apps, one way of that displays, the main way that displays is as a number in a red corner of your app icon. So if you've turned that on, which is default, and you have a bunch of emails in your inbox. There's nothing good about a red circle that has like 643 in it. Like, it's completely, it's basic. Like the red color is a sign of danger. We're trained since day zero that that's a dangerous color. And then you put a high number in there, and then suddenly you're faced with this sort of quite terrifying visual, which is a perfect example of really great information delivery from an engineering perspective. It's right. Perfect. It's like it gives you exactly what you need to know. It warns you there's loads of information here, and it tells you specifically how much information there is. So it's brilliant in one respect, but it's also not very kind.
Right.
And I think that red dot with a number sort of is a perfect poster child for a technology landscape which has been designed by engineers who haven't cared about how we feel. Yes. They cared about telling us useful things. And so we thought, okay, how do you solve the same problem, but in a way that's kind? And our solution is a really lovely one, actually, which is instead of putting a red dot, what happens is on the home screen, underneath each app icon is the name of the app, so Twitter or email or whatever, and mail. And instead of putting a number on a dot, the weight of the font is an indicator of how many messages you have. So if you've got loads of Twitter DMs or notifications, then the Twitter name will be in bold. And if you have no email, your mail app, the name of it will be very thin. And so you're still receiving the same information, but it's in a respectful way that isn't clubbing you in over the head and sort of causing you anxiety. And so, that's a very elegant and simple example. And that's I think that's the reason I wanted to mention that one, because it's a real, it's the same kind of information. It doesn't make the product less commercially powerful. I think that's the concern, for a lot of these companies who when dealing with this sort of conversation around well-being, they're like, the fear is that we have to change in such a way that our business doesn't work anymore. Right. Because they're so caught up in the idea that abuse of our attention is the only way to make money. And I guess my hope is that my message to that is like, if you are a company based on manipulation, then yeah, that's fine. Like it was sort of fine, but like that's not the change you make. You can make other changes which are more neutral, a bit more revenue neutral. So, but again, stage one is giving a damn.
And I'd encourage anyone who's listening, not if you're in your car now, but go to this webpage at designingmindfulness.com, because a picture's worth 1,000 words. I'm looking at this screenshot, or maybe it's a mock-up of an iPhone.
It's a mock-up, yeah.
And to see the difference without the badges there, and notice the difference in how you feel looking at it. I'm looking at it, and I agree. Looking at it, I don't feel that anxiety that I'd feel, not just with often I have many different apps with badges on them simultaneously on the home screen. I'm going to just mention one of my other pet peeves along this line, which is Microsoft Outlook desktop. I think by default, when you install it, it wants to notify you in 3 or 4 different ways simultaneously each time an email comes in, by popping up a window, making a sound, and doing a few other things. And every time I have to reinstall it, I immediately go in and change those settings. But, I'm always amazed when I meet someone else and they're at their laptop and I see they haven't changed those settings. And it's very anxiety producing. And in fact, you might have multiple devices, each like that in the same place. I think default settings is another place, where companies could pay some attention to, as you said, make fairly small changes that don't affect the commercial viability of the product, but could have a big positive impact on people's attention.
Exactly. And I think that's where we can go. And I think part of that is us being users. We're starting to see that already quite a lot, I think, through different parts of the industry, whether it's like ad blockers and other kinds of sort of conversations. And, there's a recent really wonderful team making a product called Siempo, which is an Android app, which basically like simplifies your Android experience to an incredible amount and strips everything away. And we're starting to see these bits of innovation, and the growth of products like Freedom and those kinds of things, and that it's definitely happening. And it's just a case of like when you're so used to, as you described, anxiety by default, you don't realize that there's another way of doing it. And so I think there is a responsibility on companies to start switching their defaults to be a bit more kind. That would be a good way forward, I think.
Well, this is great. I mean, I think we could keep talking forever, but I'd like to end on this positive note of hopefulness for the future. I think very often these conversations, can tend to be focused on everything that's wrong, everything that is anxiety producing about devices. And it's great to hear from someone who is not just thinking about how to improve technology, but it's actually doing it. So thank you for that and for the conversation, Rohan. It's really been great talking to you today.
Not at all. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks for joining us for this Technology for Mindfulness podcast with me, Robert Plotkin, and today's guest, Rohan Gunatilake, the founder of Mindfulness Everywhere and the creator of the mindfulness meditation app Buddhify. You can find out more about Rohan and Mindfulness Everywhere at Buddhify.com and mindfulnesseverywhere.io. If you liked today's episode, please leave us a review on iTunes and share the episode with your friends. Those and all other links are in the show notes. And check out our blog at technologyformindfulness.com for information and tips about science, technology, and mindfulness. I'm Robert Plotkin, and I'll join you next time on the Technology for Mindfulness podcast with Ellie Burrows, the CEO and co-founder of the Mindful Meditation Studio in New York, when we'll talk about the future of face-to-face and online meditation practice and community.